Let me give you some advice, bastard. Never forget what you are. The rest of the world will not. Wear it like armor, and it can never be used to hurt you.
It is the year 2024, and you may be watching this a year or two later, who's to say? But whenever you're seeing this, it is sure that there is a show or a book or something new from the world created by George R.R. Martin in the works, whether it be recently released or still in production. And I think that's good, probably. Personally, I was late to the party. I didn't watch Game of Thrones till around 3 years after it ended, and even as someone who wasn't even paying attention, I still very vividly remember the backlash to Season 8. It is possibly the loudest fall from grace a show has ever had. You combine the flop of the TV show's finale with the fact that the 6th book in the series, The Winds of Winter, was in limbo for nearly a decade at that point, and still is. The pop culture consensus was loud and assertive. Game of Thrones and George R.R. Martin are done. Fans of the show were gutted, and there was no continuation or closure to be found in the source material. There was this no man's land after Season 8 finished, where no one wanted to rewatch the show, and no one wanted to get into either the show or the book, because it seemed pointless. Why would you? One has a bad ending and one has no ending. It was like watching this absolute pillar of pop culture tumble off a mountain, breaking every bone along the way. The winds of time are harsh, but to those who work through them, they can be rewarding and even refreshing. Time will teach you that there is worse things that can happen than a bad ending, especially one to a TV show. And just because the bathwater has run cold doesn't mean you should throw the baby out with it. House of the Dragon released in 2022 and showed everyone that this world still has more to offer. And it did so not by being reactionary to the failure of its predecessor, but by being steady in telling a story in its own vision with its own goals as a story. This video is going to be me talking about my view of this franchise and advocating for why you should be hopping on this stationary but above water boat if you haven't already. Which means, of course, this video will have absolutely no major spoilers. The twists and turns of Game of Thrones are pretty much ubiquitous at this point. I thought I knew a lot when I was going into it, but knowing and experiencing a story are two different things. And same applies for House of the Dragon and all the books. As I'm making this video, House of the Dragon has recently finished airing its 2nd season, and it's continued to be a strong and largely engaging show despite some hiccups. And as an aside, personally, I feel the criticisms for Season 2 have been a little bit blown out of proportion, but I digress. House of the Dragon is already renewed for 2 more seasons. Another show based on the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms series of novellas is currently in production. There are also a small handful of other spin-off shows in some form of development. Which ones actually come to fruition remains to be seen. Outside of TV, George R.R. Martin is continuing to write various books. There's the aforementioned novellas, an upcoming follow-up to the source material for House of the Dragon, Fire and Blood, which is creatively named Blood and Fire. And yes, supposedly, Martin is still working on Book 6, The Winds of Winter. All we know is that Martin is still insistent on its eventual completion, along with the 7th and final book, A Dream of Spring. That's a lot of projects on the slate. And there's certainly more brewing, which we haven't heard of yet. And it's typical. IP has been... The fuck? IP has been the single most dominant factor in the entertainment industry for well over a decade now. The Disney-owned franchises are the foremost example of this. Lots of Marvel, lots of Star Wars, lots of random projects being ordered just because people will talk about what they already know. And that's half the battle of marketing won right there. This is what defines this content era of media consumption. If the audience likes a franchise, and the studios are going to give them as much of that franchise as their infrastructure can produce as quickly as possible, because some fraction of viewership is guaranteed, some fraction of discussion, especially on YouTube, is guaranteed, and that is free marketing, which is what they want. There has been great things to come out of this era, but there's this growing feeling that it's just becoming noise, and it's putting audiences in a malaise. And I think this is where this franchise kind of stands out a little bit. That while yes, it has set up its own little content mill, the distinction here, in my mind, is George R.R. Martin specifically. Any issues you may have with this man, he is the one charting, yet Oddly enough, not steering the ship, in a broad sense. This is his world that he's been fleshing out since 1996. The thing that separates Martin from a Kevin Feige or a Dave Filoni, and I do not mean this as a slight to the other two, because it's a distinction in his relationship to the material, because it is his. He created it. But moreover, the foundation for his creative choices here is more or less world building. He doesn't build up to stories for a climactic event. He builds a world where stories have happened. He has this deep love for history, specifically for medieval history, believe it or not. I get the impression that that's the driving force behind his vision, where he treats Westeros' history with the detail and richness that you would get from reading about the likes of England and Scotland and France and other made-up places. House of the Dragon itself is a great example of this charting element, as it takes the in-universe history told in Fire and Blood and retells it as a drama from the perspective of the historical figures of the book. This is important because that is more or less the integrity of the franchise, regardless of the creative liberties taken in adapting the story. The later seasons of Game of Thrones failed because once they overtook where the books left off, Martin stepped aside and the showrunners began writing the show with the intent of fulfilling the show's genre tags, creating water cooler talk moments, and writing dialogue to be reposted on social media, rather than a respect for the holistic world the earlier seasons conveyed. At this point, and this happened after I wrote this video, Martin released a blog statement, more or less denouncing House of the Dragon's second season and washing his hands of the show and its future direction, which is bizarre. Without delving into the conversation around adaptation that would need to be had to properly discuss Martin's grievances, I think, though the show has had issues crop up, those issues are of a completely different planet than what Game of Thrones went through. And it remains to be seen if those issues will fester into tearing the show apart as it goes into its third and fourth seasons. If you have not seen Game of Thrones, you should let me pull up my teleprompter. If you have not seen Game of Thrones, you should watch it. Season 8 is bad, and there's a lot that can be said about Seasons 6 and 7 as well. But I assure you, as cynically as I went into my first viewing of this show, I got lost in it. I think you have to be primed with this sense of distance, though, because as invested as I got, by Season 7, I was more just morbidly curious about how rough the show was going to get, rather than disappointed it was falling off. Truly, though, the quality dip does not define Game of Thrones to me, because the lasting impact the first 5 seasons, give or take, make is more significant to me. There are flaws within these seasons, but Game of Thrones offers, to this day, some of the richest dialogue and pitch-perfect acting you can find. And best of all, it tells a believable story in a fantasy world with a tangible sense of politics and cause and effect. The big things that happen in this show are just as compelling for the sprawling effects that they have on the story as they are for just seeing a crazy and big moment happen. And that's the most interesting part of the show, where the ongoing events are so interconnected in various ways, but you're also seeing things being driven by interpersonal politics and baggage amid clashing ambitions between the characters. Character interactions are driven by pre-existing relationships or perceptions that they have of each other, as well as the push and pull of trying to get what they want from the other in their own schemes or purposes. The writing is so consistently rich because the character writing serves so many purposes at once, which then serves the larger portrait of the narrative. So to maintain this, what characters say and how they say it, from writing to performance, is measured and purposeful. It creates this beautifully engaging experience where, even though you know where it's going, it's intuitively satisfying to observe down to the microcosms of interactions. Oh, and it's also just performed by one of the finest casts of actors in TV history. I enjoyed my time with the show so much that even after Season 8, I started the damn books. The main series, A Song of Ice and Fire, has released 5 books, and I've read the first 2, A Game of Thrones and A Clash of Kings, and I am sure I will get around to starting A Storm of Swords at some point. I'm slow at getting through books. I only like to read when everything around me is quiet, so I can focus on it, which means I'm pretty picky with the books that I start, since I don't just fly through them. So I was kind of worried that I would just kind of get bored and feel like I'm re-experiencing the show, but in a different medium. But they far exceeded my expectations. Both Game of Thrones and Clash of Kings are beautifully written, but what fascinated me was how different but cohesive they are to each other. The show had a very focused and streamlined season 1, and then split off in a bunch of directions with the different characters, seeing how things developed from how the first season ended. And that same shift is present within the books, which on a functional narrative level and a pacing level, it's really impressive that they translated that to the screen. The show captured this well, but the books are books. They're longer, denser with plot and detail, and they're longer, which helps. A Game of Thrones is such a captivating read as it's long, but it breezes by, smartly intertwines its world building with the ongoing plot in organic ways, and A Clash of Kings is just a massive tapestry. It jumps around a lot, it dives deeper into the characters, you feel the magnitude and upheaval of its story. The marketing on the back of the book ends with the line, "For when kings clash, the whole land trembles," and the book definitely lives up to conveying that idea. The story is told through POV chapters jumping between different characters, and this is where I think the books really make themselves must-reads, even if you've seen the show. Martin does an incredible job at making each POV feel distinct and true to the character he's writing. Something about the prose and the cadence of the words shifts depending on the character. You feel the bitter weather of the far north and the unassuredness of Jon Snow, the wit and perceptiveness of Tyrion Lannister, and the suffocation and timidness of Sansa Stark. The Theon chapters in A Clash of Kings specifically struck me as having this potent level of texture and detail, and his whole part of the story was condensed pretty heavily for the show, so it felt fresh to read. And I don't mean that as a knock on the show. If anything, reading the books made me appreciate just how good of a job the show did in adapting the books and streamlining their story for TV. Season 1, specifically, is as good as the book. The story translates so well to being performed in live action, and is just generally much more easily cut down for TV than the second book, and I assume the later books as well. I think I enjoyed reading the book after the show more than I would have if I had read it before, because I wasn't hung up on visualizing or memorizing the dense descriptions of the large cast of characters and locations, and I could instead focus more on the experience of Martin's writing. And that's a high compliment to the show, because it's rare to bridge your experience with an adaptation to the source material so seamlessly and with minimal felt redundancies. I have loved my time with the books, and I'm very excited to read A Storm of Swords. I've heard that the 2 books after it are a little more divisive. The first 3 seem to be where most of the praise comes from, but it seems the further into the books you get, the more they and the show deviate, so I'm very intrigued to read them at least. I understand the feeling of unrest and apathy that's still attached to this franchise, and it might take 2 years for me to finish the next 3 books, and it wouldn't be safe to bet that book 6 would be out by then. House of the Dragon Season 2 had more than a few issues, and a lot of the fandom is treating it like the show is up in flames, despite it still being very artfully crafted and, in my opinion, well written more often than not. And all of this is to say that no other major franchise is in this position, the one that this one finds itself in, that at least I'm aware of. None of them have the same reverence for this holistic, worldly context, and the characters, when the writing is working the way it should be, are at the mercy of the context they exist within and the consequences of when it's upset or changed by the wills of history and the ambitions of those who move them. And regardless of how long he personally stays involved with any given project, George R.R. Martin has so far, and seemingly will continue, to have his world explored and expanded in the instances and chapters of its history he sees fit to elaborate on. And that, to me, is an exciting approach. Even if he usually dips out of involvement too soon, like a guy, we should work on that one. You don't toss the baby out with the bathwater, and you don't regret pouring the water for it turning cold. Regardless of the outcome, the water maintained its purpose for a time, and there's more to be found in the well. Stories aren't necessarily their endings. With Ice and Fire, the substance is the world, the history, and the broader development of the players within them. Whether or not an ending is satisfying doesn't undercut the previously conveyed substance of the franchise. I am not claiming it to be above criticism or to say that the creatives behind these projects shouldn't worry about quality control. I'm advocating against the idea that a story, especially one segmented in seasons and episodes and novels, should be discarded and deemed valueless because of a drop in quality or lack of resolution. There's a legitimate conversation that has been had over the years, since season 8, and it should continue to be had about respecting the audience and the opportunity to tell stories on this scale, and of course the story itself, all of which I feel season 8 of Game of Thrones specifically violated, and reading or watching what the showrunners had to say about it make it all the more damning. It's sad, and I'm sure we're all on the same page in not having any interest in whatever they do next, because they so drastically mishandled a massive creative and cultural and financial privilege and refuse to relinquish it to more interested hands. And all that is very different to simple, misguided creative decisions. And that's why I'm so fascinated and just having a grand old time here, because the longer I've spent with this series, it's engaged me in ways that I did not expect. I started, like I imagine anyone else did, with the show and just wanting a captivating TV show to enjoy it like I would a Breaking Bad or whatever. And it makes sense that a season 8 like this show had would be dreadful and off-putting with that in mind. But the enjoyment and satisfaction of seeing the story unfold existed outside of the need for something conclusive. At least for me. Simply put, the thematic depth of the story largely exists within the context of the world and the movements of the characters within it, rather than a specific character's arc or resolution of the plot lines. I think I might be being a total nerd about this. Maybe this point of view is just very specific and not widely applicable, but this franchise for me has been a great way to evaluate how I value and engage with storytelling. And even more than that, with established intellectual property, especially when there is so much of that right now. The question ultimately in this video is, where does substance and satisfaction begin and end for you in media? And is your standards universal to all, regardless of genre or form? So yeah, to close, I do think this franchise is absolutely worth diving into. I think it's worth going back to. I think it has a lot of rewatch value. I think it's interesting to think about. And if you did, already see all this stuff or read it and you fell off of it and you never felt the desire to go back after being burned by it, ask yourself, where and why exactly does the value get cut off for you? And really, ultimately, all these questions are meant to get at the root of building a more mindful and conscious way of the consumption, where you're watching stuff and engaging with stuff for a reason, instead of just kind of like mindlessly being taken on these corporate mandated rides. So yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you for sticking around. How do I feel about the teleprompter? It's alright. It feels a little restrictive. Maybe it needs to go slower. That would be a damn good thing to, think about, but I like the one that I found.